just identify that these are two different decks masquerading as one deck, right? That's the most important thing. That's the most important thing. I think hand buff is an archetype that is fundamentally a bit slower, or at least the payoff for designing it is a bit slower. And one thing that I'm having a problem with is Mobilize, because I think Mobilize and Demacia in general don't really do a single thing for this deck. The card that you don't have here, which is Silverwing Vanguard, which makes a lot of sense in hand buff, and therefore Demacia makes a lot of sense in hand buff. And this deck doesn't have that, which is weird. Because if you don't have Silverwing, then you shouldn't be in Demacia, I think. So you're in the right region for the wrong reasons. So yeah, the problem with mobilizing this deck is it doesn't really add very much. Like, the idea of hand buff doesn't really synergize with the idea of mobilize necessarily. Now, okay, actually, let me clarify. It actually does synergize. When I say it doesn't synergize, it actually does synergize. Because when you're using, you know, tools like Green Glade Elder, you're committed to do a double float. Sown Seed, Green Glade Elder, and Mobilize all have effects which scale with the size of your hands. There's a play pattern you can do, which is double float on turn 1 and turn 2, and have a big hand. And if you're committing to a double float, then it makes more sense to do this. There's a couple of problems with that, which is I think some of these cards don't really like make as much sense when committing to a double float. I personally would say Sparring Student. Like, I know the point is, like, making him cheap and then flooding him out, so he's kind of okay. But I still don't think he's an amazing card if I'm not actually controlling the board for the first few turns of the game. I don't think so. So I would run this deck a bit slower. I would run Jeweled Protector. I would cut Sown Seeds, Mobilize, and I think probably Green Glade Elder. The identity of hand buff in this game is not really to double float and not really to go wide. Part of the problem with the double float being the identity for hand buff is Inspiring Mentor is probably the most efficient hand buff tool in the game, and Navorican Spirit is a great second round follow-up to Mentor, allowing you to reuse Mentor for the hand buff, right? So you look at where the high value hand buff cards actually are, and more importantly, where the high value payoff cards actually are. The high value payoff cards for hand buff, let's break them down. There's Navori Highwayman, who doubles the buffs you have in hand. There's Zed, who doubles the buffs you have in hand. There's Kinko Lifeblade, who has, you know, Lifesteal and Elusive. And then there's Zephyr Sage as an additional payoff, right? Which is if you have something big in hand that is redoubled off of Zephyr Sage, if you're able to wait long enough before playing it, which is really greedy, I don't think this card is good. I don't think you can afford to sit with this many buffs in your hand by turn 6. It doesn't really make sense. But in theory, this would be payoff. And the last one is the Silverwing Vanguard. The last one I can think of right now anyways is the Silverwing Vanguard, which I mentioned earlier. So that's all the payoff. You'll notice one thing in common with it. A, there's not an amazing amount of it, and B, none of the payoff really scales with the amount of buffs that are in your hands. Therefore, hand buff is a build that should be built a lot more about consolidating buffs on specific units, rather than trying to go too wide. Green Glade Elder is a card that gains some value off the double float being anti-synergistic with Mentor, you know, and Navori Conspirator, which is really, really awkward. And Sown Seeds just being a shit card in general that you kind of never really want. So basically, the thing to understand here is that hand buff is a variable concept, right? And this is important. Again, remember when we looked at elites, and I was saying, you can look at the elite tag, but the most important thing is to realize that cheap elites are the ones that give you value. Because they're the ones that trigger Blacksmith, and they're the ones that trigger Vanguard Squire for her discount, and they're the ones who pick up the buffs on Vanguard Bannerman, who is, I mean, he's an elite card just as much as anything else, because Allegiance and elites is the same thing, okay? That's important. Whereas, like, expensive elite tags might as well not even be elite tags, right? Cytheria the Bold. This doesn't even have to have elite tag. It almost makes no difference. And that's really, really important to identify. So when we're looking at synergy, we always want to identify what exactly about that synergy we want to play for, okay? So, again, in the same way, you break down hand buff as a concept. And the thing is, you identify what the strongest hand buff tools are. Inspiring Mentor is great, you know, and you do want some degree of early aggression because of Zed. But at the end of the day, the most important thing to do is to break down. There's like single target hand buff and AoE hand buff. Single target hand buff wants to use Mentor turn 1, Conspirator turn 2. They want to control the board and play more aggressively. They can't really afford to double float because you want to do that kind of like opener. You don't necessarily need to close out the game super early, right? Like you can still use the Silverwing Vanguards to make it a little bit slower, but you don't want to like keep your hand big and cluttered, right? The full hand size hand buff, which is Greenglade Elder, Sown Seeds, and potentially Mobilize, potentially. That's a different deck. It's going to play basically for the committed double float, and there's probably not enough tools to make that deck work right now, honestly. I just don't think that concept has enough support in the game where I have an entire hand's worth of cards I want to buff to gain maximum value of. And to be perfectly honest, these 3 cards are just too weak. Greenglade Elder is just like really, really, really slow to get value out of. And yeah, that's basically it. So just identify that these are 2 different decks masquerading as one deck, right? That's the most important thing. That's the most important thing. And one of them is bad. So let's cut out all the bad cards, go for a more focused version of buffing. And then lastly, identify that Zephyr Sage, even though it fits the concept, the sub-concept that we're doing, it's still probably just too slow. It's still just too greedy. It's only going to be good if you can buff something big a few times, like at least a couple times, and then not play it, and then turn 6 you're still alive and good, and then you play this. It's just too slow. This needed to be discounted quite a bit more than 6 to really be a playable card. What about Freljord? Omen Hawk is busted. Omen Hawk is a pretty powerful card. I think I would go with Silverwing Vanguard here, Precipic, and that comes back to kind of the final explanation, which is, as we all know, the split between enablers versus payoff. I'm not going to draw the squares and the rectangles this time. I mean, you guys know that at this point, but the idea is just identify like the power level and effective value of each criteria. Here we've got Navari Highwayman, who's, okay, so let's just count, right? Sparring Student, so, you know, let's call the enabler to the strategy the buffs, and the payoffs the buff targets, right? So the enablers are, sorry, not Sparring Student. The enablers are Inspiring Mentor, Navari Conspirator, because it bounces Inspiring Mentor, right? This shouldn't be in the deck, I think. Standalone is definitely somewhat of an enabler, but I don't know if it should be in the deck, right? So we have a couple buff targets there, and then we've got the Jeweled Protector that I was saying I think would try to be in the deck. I'm not 100% sure about that. It is definitely a little slow. It's not nearly as slow as the Zephyr Sage, but, you know, I think for a +3/+3 on a redoubled stat line, I think that is worth it, probably. If that's not worth it, then this deck as a concept just doesn't make enough sense. I think Jeweled Protector has to be worth it for this deck to make sense. So those are our enablers. Sparring Student, Jeweled Protector, and Navari Conspirator. That's basically it at this point. Is there something else that I'm missing that we wanted to add? Because there's not a lot in terms of like the single target buff targets, right? Now let's look at the payoff. Let's look at the buff targets. While Navari Conspirator is not a terrible buff target, he's okay. I mean, often Mentor into Conspirator, you know, you're buffing out Elusive, that's fine. Greenglade Duo is totally fine. Very good in Shadow Isles where they have 1 damage removal and you want to bump this out of range. Shadow Assassin, not so much, but I mean, using it on Elusive is never terrible. Kinko Lifeblade is definitely a feasible buff target. I'm not 100% sure if this should be in the deck, honestly, but I think it's probably fine. Like, it does represent a buff target. And that's pretty much on, oh yeah, and Zad, of course. Especially if you're against, like, PNZ, who will be rocking, like, 2 or 3 Mystic Shots every time. Definitely buffing Zad is super high value. So, the question is, and here's the question, does this arrangement need more enablers or more payoff? Because you want to kind of balance not an amount of each, but a sort of value of each. So, you know, if we have 2 really, really, really strong payoffs, then we need more enablers, right? Right now, what would you say we have more value in, and therefore, you know, the other one would be the one that we would want more of? Because it's actually, it's pretty close in this situation. It's fairly close. And a lot of it comes down to timing as well, because certain payoff works with certain enablers. Like, for example, Jeweled... This is a simplification, so, like, the Jeweled Protector doesn't really work with Zed. Even though Jeweled Protector is, you know, an enabler and Zed is payoff, it's still, you know, Jeweled Protector is slower and Zed kind of wants to be played on turn 3, right? I mean, there's obviously a weird hand state where you draw a Zed late, but that's very niche, right? We need more enablers. Yes, that is basically the idea we're having as well. We need more enablers, and payoff is nice, but we're already getting like a lot of good values out of like doubling up effects from not leaving the region. So a good example of that is going to be, you know, Kinko Lifeblade. Even though it's not doubling in the same way that Highwayman is doubling the buffs, it's still going to be able to double the buffs because it's got lifesteal. So, you know, when you have like plus attack, you're kind of doubling because you're getting one attack and then one health every turn effectively, right? So therefore, because we need more enablers, and because Omen Hawk is a nice early drop for this deck, it does look like if we're just looking at Omen Hawk versus Silverwing Vanguard, if we're just looking at those two cards, it will end up probably being Omen Hawk, right? It's a great turn 1 play. It's a great Navori Conspirator target, which is important because you won't always be drawing Mentor. So it does look like Freljord is potentially the second color to be in here. We will have to build the own deck at that point. But I think the most important thing is just kind of this process of these first steps, right? So we have a core concept. Make sure we identify precisely, define what that core concept is, and don't be fooled when there's different things that like feel like they're under the same umbrella. Like when you think about it, like Mobilize and Greenglade Elder, they do have concepts that alter your hand, but they end up not, they're just kind of fakes. They don't actually fit the specific concept that we're in. And the specific concept that we're in is A, finding cards that are going to give high value single target buffs, and B, finding cards that want to be buffed by those, right? Particularly cards that can only be gotten value out of if they got buffed in the hand, right? And Silverwing Vanguard being like maybe not in the deck means that Highwayman is like kind of the biggest deal for that right now, whereas like a lot of other things we can just use buffs in other ways, right? So, you know, it's possible it's a little bit of a weak deck. But the most important thing is, why did we come to that conclusion? Well, we came to that conclusion because we looked at were the cards that were inherently already strong and inherently already weak were, right? That's really important. Inspiring Mentor, Navori Conspirator, Navori Highwayman, Kinko Lifeblade, and Zed are all cards that are pretty much just solid cards and are on the power level. Omen Hawk and Silverwing Vanguard too, and those both support, both of those, regardless of which we choose, are going to support this kind of build of deck. Whereas Greenglade Elder, Sown Seeds, and Mobilize, it's a different kind of deck. You know, you would play the first two turns completely differently, and ultimately these three cards are only supported by themselves pretty much and are not really good enough. So we identify the way to play the deck forward is to kind of focus more on the single target stuff, go a bit more aggressive, but slow down a little bit because, I mean, we are probably going to want Jeweled Protector coming in here. Again, if this card doesn't end up making sense in the final version of the deck, then this deck doesn't make sense. So I think it's fair to say that we should assume this card makes sense. And during the deck build process, and then if what we end up with is a pile of garbage, then we can just leave and try something else, basically, okay? So we identify what precisely our deck is playing for, making sure to, like, define, like, exactly, like, not just let's alter cards in hand, but, you know, this specific game plan, and then identify which area in the deck we're a little bit weaker on, and which card between Silverwing, Vanguard, and Omen Hawk ends up fitting us a bit better. To be perfectly honest, it totally could be Silverwing Vanguard still. It's pretty close, and Demacia is a stronger region than Freljord in general, but we decided Omen Hawk in this case. That's how we'll proceed with the build, and then we can go ahead and build the deck out.